The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows against the bare walls. Rain pattered lightly against the window, a slow, rhythmic sound that should have been calming, but instead it only heightened my unease. The apartment was too quiet, too still. I sat on the edge of my bed, the sheets crumpled beneath me, my fingers absently tracing the pattern of the fabric. The air carried the faint scent of cologne, his cologne. A scent that had lingered long after he left. I should have showered by now, washed away the evidence of his touch, but I couldn't move. Not yet. A shiver ran down my spine, though the room was warm. I wasn't sure if it was from the cool air seeping in through the half-open window or the weight of the night pressing down on me. My phone lay beside me, the screen dark. No messages. No calls. I glanced at the clock. 1:42 a.m. He should have been back by now. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, and I flinched. My pulse quickened, the unease curling tighter in my chest. Something about the night felt off. Then it happened. A sharp knock at the door. Not a casual rap, but firm. Authoritative. I froze. My heart pounded against my ribs, my breath catching in my throat. Who the hell could be at my door at this hour? I reached for my phone, hesitating before unlocking it. No missed calls. No texts from him. Just the eerie silence of the night pressing in around me. The knock came again. Louder this time. I swallowed hard, throwing a glance toward the mirror on the far side of the room. My reflection stared back, disheveled hair, flushed skin, the ghost of a reckless decision still clinging to my expression. I wasn't dressed. Another knock. Impatient. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I pushed off the bed, grabbing the nearest article of clothing, a towel draped over the chair. Wrapping it around my waist, I moved toward the door, my bare feet silent against the hardwood floor. I reached for the handle, hesitating. Then a voice. Deep, commanding. This is the police. Open the door. My breath hitched. My fingers trembled over the lock. My mind raced. Why were they here? Did they know? A cold knot twisted in my stomach as I turned the handle and pulled the door open. And there he stood. A police officer, his uniform crisp, his stance firm. His piercing eyes met mine, scanning me, my face, my bare chest, the towel hanging loosely around my waist. And then, something flickered in his gaze. Recognition. And in that moment I knew. This wasn't just any officer. This was him. The moment I saw his face, a jolt of shock tore through me. Officer James Carter. The same James who had whispered my name in the dark just hours ago. The same James whose lips had pressed against mine in the quiet of my bedroom. Now, he stood in front of me, his uniform stark and imposing, his badge gleaming under the dim hallway light. But his eyes, those stormy, unreadable eyes, held something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? Regret? I gripped the towel tighter around my waist, my pulse hammering so loudly I thought he could hear it. James. I breathed, my voice barely audible. His expression didn't change, but I saw it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled at his sides as if he were bracing himself. Mr. Hayes, he said, his tone professional, clipped. The name hit like a slap. I flinched. We weren't strangers. Not after what happened tonight. What's going on? I asked, forcing myself to hold his gaze. He exhaled slowly, his hand resting on his utility belt. There's been a report of a disturbance in this apartment. My stomach clenched. A disturbance? My voice was hoarse, the words foreign in my mouth. He nodded. A neighbor called it in. Said they heard noises, possible altercation. His eyes flickered over me, scanning my face, my chest, the towel. Are you alone? The question sent a chill down my spine. The way he said it, so detached, so unlike the man who had held me just hours ago, made my skin prickle. I swallowed hard. James, what are you doing? He didn't answer immediately. His lips pressed into a thin line as he took a step forward, enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. The scent of his aftershave, subtle, familiar, washed over me, dragging me back into the memory of earlier that night. The weight of him against me. The way his breath had hitched when I traced my fingers down his spine. The way he had murmured my name like a secret he was terrified of saying out loud. And now he was standing here, a stranger. "I need to come in," he said, his voice quieter this time. For a second I thought about refusing. About slamming the door in his face and pretending none of this was happening. But I couldn't. Not with the way his eyes searched mine. Not with the way my chest ached at the space between us. I stepped back, letting the door swing open. James moved past me, his posture rigid as he scanned the apartment. His gaze landed on the crumpled sheets of my bed, the discarded clothes on the floor, the remnants of our reckless night still evident in every corner of the room. I watched as his throat bobbed, his jaw tightening. "Are you going to tell me what this is really about?" I asked, crossing my arms over my chest. He hesitated, then turned to face me. "We can't do this." The words hit harder than I expected. I let out a breathy, humorless laugh. "You've already done it, James. Twice, if we're keeping track." His expression darkened. It was a mistake. A sharp sting bloomed in my chest. I had braced myself for this, hadn't I? Had told myself not to get attached. That whatever was happening between us was fleeting, a secret that couldn't exist beyond the four walls of my apartment. But hearing him say it, I took a step closer, searching his face. Was it? James clenched his jaw, but he didn't move away. I reached for his hand, instinct, desperation, I wasn't sure, but he jerked back as if my touch burned him. "This can't happen again," he said, quieter this time, almost pleading. I could feel the war inside him. The pull of desire against the weight of obligation. The need to do what was expected of him versus what he really wanted. "I know what this is really about," I murmured, my voice steady even as my heart pounded. "You're scared." His eyes snapped to mine, dark and stormy. "I'm not scared." "Yes, you are." I took another step, closing the space between us. "You think if you push me away, if you bury this deep enough, it'll just disappear. But it won't. I won't." His breathing was unsteady now, his fingers twitching at his sides. I could see it, the unraveling. The way his walls were starting to crack. "Tell me you don't want this," I whispered. "Look me in the eye and tell me that what happened tonight meant nothing to you." Silence stretched between us. Thick. Heavy. Then, before I could react, James reached out, his fingers grazing my jaw, his touch hesitant but electric. I leaned into it instinctively, my breath hitching. "I can't," he admitted, the words barely above a whisper. "I can't say that." Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door made us both freeze. James stepped back instantly, his hand dropping to his side. His mask was back in place, the vulnerability in his eyes replaced with cold detachment. Another knock. More insistent this time. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry. "Who?" James shook his head. "Don't answer it." My pulse spiked. "James, what the hell is going on?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his radio, his voice low but urgent as he spoke into it. "Unit 47, this is Officer Carter. Situation compromised." I repeat, situation compromised. A pit formed in my stomach. "James, stay behind me," he ordered, his hand moving to his holster. Panic clawed at my throat. I wanted to ask him what the hell was happening, why he looked so tense, why the air in the room had suddenly turned suffocating. But then, the door burst open, and everything went to hell. The door slammed open so hard it rattled the frame. I barely had time to register the two figures storming inside before James shoved me backward, his arm pressing against my chest in a protective motion. His body tensed, his stance shifting slightly, one hand hovering near his holster, the other raised in a silent command for me to stay back. My breath hitched. Who the hell were these people? The first man stepped forward, his face shadowed under the dim entryway light. He was broad, his presence heavy, and his eyes flicked between James and me before landing on the towel still clutched at my waist. A sneer twisted his lips. "Guess the rumors were true," the man muttered, voice like gravel. James didn't move, but I felt the subtle tightening of his muscles. He knew this man. The second man, leaner but equally intimidating, pulled the door shut behind them, sealing us inside. Trapping us. A strange, electric tension crackled in the air. James's voice came out sharp, clip. "You're not supposed to be here." The first man scoffed. "Neither are you, Officer Carter." His gaze flickered to me again. "I gotta say, this is one hell of a way to find out about your extracurricular activities." My stomach dropped. James shifted slightly, putting more space between me and them. His entire body was coiled like a spring, ready to snap. "I don't know what you think you're doing," James said, voice carefully controlled, "but you need to leave." The second man smirked. "Or what?" Something dark passed between them. An unspoken threat. A history I wasn't privy to. The silence stretched too long. And then, everything happened at once. The broad man lunged. James moved faster. A blur of motion. A sharp grunt. The crash of bodies colliding. The towel slipped from my grasp as I stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the bed. Panic surged through me. I'd barely processed James and the man struggling before the second guy made his move, reaching into his jacket. I saw the glint of metal. Gun. Everything in me screamed move, but I was frozen, my mind trying to catch up. James reacted before I could. A deafening crack split the air. The second man staggered back, clutching his arm where James's shot had grazed him. His curse was drowned out by the heavy ringing in my ears. The broad man used the distraction to slam James against the wall. Hard. James's head snapped back, a strangled sound escaping his lips. Something in me broke. I didn't think. I just moved. Grabbing the closest thing I could, a lamp from the nightstand, I swung. The crack when it connected with the broad man's skull was sickening. He stumbled, eyes going unfocused, and James didn't hesitate. He drove his elbow into the man's gut, then spun and pinned him against the wall, his forearm pressing hard against his throat. The second man was already making a break for the door, clutching his injured arm. The moment it clicked shut behind him, silence fell. Heavy. Suffocating. The only sound was our breathing. James's grip on the broad man didn't loosen. His knuckles were white, his chest rising and falling in ragged bursts. Then, finally, "You set me up," James hissed. The words sent a fresh jolt through me. "Set him up?" The man let out a choked, breathless laugh. "Took you long enough to figure it out." James's grip tightened. "James," I murmured, stepping forward. I didn't recognize my own voice. It was too raw. He didn't move. Didn't blink. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought it might shatter. Something dark was taking over him. Something I hadn't seen before. I reached out, barely grazing my fingers against his arm. "James, stop." He flinched like I had burned him. Then, slowly, so slowly, he loosened his grip. The broad man sucked in a ragged breath, but before he could gloat, James shoved him hard. "Get the hell out." The man wiped the blood from his mouth, looking at James like he had won something. Like he knew something James didn't. And then he was gone. The door clicked shut. Silence again. James didn't turn to face me. For a long moment, he just stood there, shoulders heaving, his fists still clenched at his sides. Then, finally, he spoke. "This isn't over." I swallowed hard. "James." He turned, and the look in his eyes stopped me cold. Haunted. Wrecked. Angry. But beneath all of it, fear. I stepped closer. "Tell me what's going on." His jaw tightened. "I can't." Frustration clawed at me. "James, I can't." The words echoed in the space between us, loud and sharp and final. My chest ached. He dragged a shaky hand through his hair, exhaling hard. His entire body was trembling. I wanted to reach for him. To touch him. to tell him I wasn't going anywhere. But I didn't. Because I already knew what was coming. James met my gaze, his expression unreadable now. Walls back up. And then, he turned and walked out. The door shut behind him, leaving me alone, heart pounding, mind spinning, still wrapped in the scent of him, and with more questions than answers. The silence in my apartment felt too loud. I stood there, staring at the door James had just walked out of, my chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. The room still carried the remnants of his presence. His scent lingering in the air, the heat of his body still felt on my skin, the weight of his absence pressing down on me. My legs felt unsteady as I moved, slowly, cautiously, as if one wrong step would shatter the fragile moment hanging in the air. I glanced at the broken lamp on the floor, its shattered pieces reflecting the dim light like tiny knives. The bed was still a mess, the sheets tangled, the night's passion and chaos woven into every crease. The tension of what had just happened still lingered, crackling like static electricity. James had left, and he had taken the truth with him. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my fingers gripping the fabric, my mind racing. Who the hell were those men? What did they mean by setting him up? And why the hell had James looked so afraid? I clenched my jaw, frustration curling inside me. He had let me in just enough to feel something real, only to rip it away the moment it got too close, too messy, too undeniable. I should have been angry. I should have told myself this was a mistake. Instead, I could still feel the ghost of his touch on my skin. I stood abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something other than sit in this thick, suffocating silence. My feet carried me to the window, my hands pressing against the cool glass as I stared down at the street below. Then, I saw him. James stood next to his patrol car, his back to me. His hands were braced against the hood, his head hanging low, his entire body radiating tension. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there. For a second, I thought he might turn around, might glance up, might look at me the way he had earlier that night, before everything had fallen apart. But he didn't. Instead, after what felt like forever, he straightened, climbed into his car, and drove away. I let out a shaky breath, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. I wasn't letting this go. The next day, I went about my routine, but it all felt off. My coffee tasted bitter, my apartment felt colder, and every little sound made me flinch. I couldn't shake the unease, the lingering questions clawing at my mind. I told myself I wouldn't call him. I lasted 6 hours. The phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. I exhaled through my nose and tried again. No answer. I cursed under my breath, pacing my living room, my heart hammering as I debated whether to drive to his place, to his precinct, to anywhere that could give me answers. Before I could make a decision, my phone buzzed. James. My pulse jumped as I scrambled to answer. James. Silence. Then, his voice, low, rough, exhausted. Stop calling me. A sharp sting shot through my chest. Are you serious? I'm serious. I clenched my jaw. After last night, you really think I'm just going to pretend nothing happened? More silence. Then, a slow, shuddering breath. It's better this way, he said finally. No. Not after what I saw in his eyes. Not after the way his body had betrayed his words, the way he had trembled beneath my touch. You don't believe that? A bitter laugh. Doesn't matter what I believe. My throat tightened. James, talk to me. Please. He was quiet for too long. Then, his voice, lower, almost a whisper. It's not safe. My stomach twisted. Not safe. I repeated, gripping the phone. James, what the hell does that mean? Click. The line went dead. I stared at my phone, my blood running cold. Something was wrong. And James was in the middle of it. I wasn't letting this go. I stared at my phone, my pulse a frantic drum in my ears. James had just hung up on me. Not in frustration. Not in anger. In fear. I could still hear his last words, barely more than a whisper. It's not safe. A chill crawled down my spine. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, but the unease only grew. What the hell had I just been pulled into? I looked around my apartment, suddenly feeling exposed. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak in the floor louder. My instincts screamed at me, something wasn't right. James was trying to shut me out. But I wasn't going anywhere. I grabbed my keys, my body moving before my brain caught up. Within minutes, I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The city lights blurred past me as I drove, the streets unnervingly quiet for this time of night. James had secret. I'd always known that. But last night, what happened in that room, those men, the gunshot, was something deeper, darker, and it had nothing to do with just us. As I turned onto his street, my chest tightened. His patrol car wasn't parked outside his building. His apartment windows were dark. Something was wrong. I parked and sprinted up the steps, my breath coming in short bursts. I knocked once, then twice, then harder. Nothing. I pulled out my phone and called him again. Voicemail. A sinking feeling settled in my gut. I wasn't giving up. Not yet. I moved to knock again, but as I raised my fist, something made me freeze. The door. It was cracked open. My pulse stopped. I hesitated for only a second before pushing it open wider, my heart hammering against my ribs. The apartment was too quiet. Too still. I stepped inside. The air felt wrong, stale, heavy, like the aftermath of something violent. Then I saw it. The overturned chair. The shattered glass on the floor. And on the wall, smeared unevenly like it had been wiped in a hurry. Blood. My stomach dropped. I exhaled, slow and shaky, before taking another step. The apartment was a mess. Papers scattered, furniture out of place, like someone had searched for something. Or someone. My phone felt heavy in my hand. I should call someone. The police. His precinct. But my gut twisted at the thought. What if they were in on it? What if James's warning had been about them? A creak from the hallway sent ice down my spine. I wasn't alone. Before I could react, a voice, low, unfamiliar, dangerous, cut through the darkness. You should have stayed out of this. And then, everything went black.